Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. I thought I would begin. I'm a philosopher, professional philosopher, teach philosophy, but also write fiction. My last book was not fiction. I hope it wasn't fiction. And Steve, of course, is a cognitive scientist. And what we thought we would talk about today is recapitulate in our own relationship the history of philosophy and science. And it's an interesting history, the history of philosophy and science. Also, I suppose our history is interesting. As you probably know, and here when I say philosophy, I'm talking about Western philosophy. It's really the only kind of philosophy that I know, that I'm trained in. It goes back to the ancient Greeks, and there was no real distinction between philosophy and science for a very long time in our intellectual history. That philosophers proposed all sorts of questions and often tried to answer them or proposed multiple possible answers. And then science, when it developed the right methodology, took those questions that had been discussed often for centuries by philosophers and finally answered them. So all of physics and biology, all of the questions that had been asked by physicists and biologists, were asked by the ancient Greek philosophers, questions of cosmology as well. And then, finally, when science found the right methodology, the right empirical methodology in the 17th century, Galileo and then Sir Isaac Newton proposed answers. So as science makes progress, philosophy shrinks. It gets smaller and smaller. And some people, especially some scientists, think that this process will continue for a very long time until there'll be no philosophical questions whatsoever. The only good of philosophy is to propose the questions, to discover the questions, so that scientists can get to work on it, but then there's really no real work for philosophy to do, so that eventually the set of philosophical questions will equal the null set. There'll be nothing. I don't believe this to be true, but Steve perhaps does. And in particular, there are two sorts of problems that we want to talk about tonight, both of which we've been involved with professionally. And they're the kinds of questions that until quite recently, until the advances made by Steve's science in particular, were off the table scientifically. They really belonged to philosophers. And these two questions are consciousness, the nature of consciousness, the relationship of consciousness to the physical body, and also morality, the questions of ethics. Certainly, both of these questions have been considered and discussed ad infinitum by philosophers. But Steve's science now has perhaps taken them out of the sphere of philosophy and into science. I don't think so, but perhaps he does. So, do you want to take it from there?
Yeah, so we'll begin with the science of consciousness, which is a topic certainly that was studied and analyzed by philosophers before scientists took it on as a topic, and that there is a science of consciousness. This should not be surprising because we know that consciousness depends critically, in fact exclusively, on the physiological activity of the brain. When you go in for surgery, the anesthesiologist puts a mask over your face or injects you with a chemical, and the anesthesiologist knows that he or she can turn your consciousness off for a few hours and then it'll come back on. Or if you take a drug, a hallucinogenic drug like LSD, your consciousness changes. This little chemical in a pill or in a liquid can change the colors that you see, the shapes that you see. If you are treated by a psychiatrist for emotional disorders, you might take an antidepressant. Again, a little bit of chemistry, and the chemistry changes your experience, your mood. If a surgeon cuts the band of fibers that connects your left hemisphere to your right hemisphere, it's almost as if that knife bisects consciousness in two, and there are two consciousnesses going on inside the same skull. We also can say something about why we have consciousness. That is, why in the course of evolution, the brain was put together so that some kinds of information processing going on in the brain are conscious. We can talk about them, we can reflect on them, they can affect our choices and our decisions, whereas other kinds of information processing in the brain are unconscious. We can't access them. So for example, when I reach over and pick up a bottle, I'm conscious that I wanted to do that, I'm conscious that I am doing it. I couldn't tell you what exact sequence of muscle movements are necessary to pick it up just enough that I don't drop it or squeeze it. When I speak, there are many computations going on in my brain that select the words out of my mental dictionary, that put them together in just the right sequence so that they are grammatical and they convey ideas. I can't tell you what they are. I can tell you what they are because I'm also a linguist, so I study it, but I certainly can't sense it as I am speaking in real time. These are computations that take place in the brain, they have to, but they are not part of consciousness. Why should the brain be organized so that there are two streams of information, one that's conscious, one that's unconscious? Probably just like any computational system, the kinds of computations that come out the same way, that don't depend on the current situation, but always work in the same way. So for example, the rules of English are the same 5 minutes ago as they are today. It would be a waste of time for me to think about, does the subject come before the verb, or does the object go after the verb, and when do I add an S onto the verb, and when do I add an ED onto an S onto a noun? It'd be a waste. It would be confusing for that to be conscious, because it's the same Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and at 2 o'clock and at 3 o'clock. You may as well just have it encapsulated in a little mental chip, so to speak, that does its thing without having to take effort and attention away from the part of the brain that is thinking about the current situation, about what's changing, what's fluxing, what's in flux, what is relevant to the particular goals that I have right now. And we even are making progress in identifying what in the brain corresponds to conscious experience. That is, what is it that actually goes off when the anesthesiologist puts the mask over your face, or when you fall asleep and you're not dreaming? It's probably there are loops of activity from the thalamus, which is an organ deep in the middle of the brain, and the cortex, the wrinkly surface of the brain, that the activity goes in a cycle about 40 times a second, and the parts of the brain in the frontal lobe and a little bit in the sides, the parietal lobe, when they are involved in these loops of activity going on 40 times a second, that corresponds to being conscious. Other parts of the brain, that the neurons are all firing, they're all active, but if they're not firing in that way, then the whole person is not conscious of that activity, can't remember it, can't describe it, can't use it to guide behavior. So that's a very short summary of what we know about the science of consciousness, and the question is, does that leave any aspect of consciousness that perhaps cannot be studied any further in the lab, but that is necessarily clarified or explained by philosophy?
Yeah. So, of course, everything that you just described is we categorize as the easy problems of consciousness. Not that they're so easy, right? But there is this problem that we characterize as the hard problem of consciousness, and it's a very singular problem. And I think it's terrifically important to keep it in mind that nothing that you said has answered this particular problem yet. And perhaps it really is a singular problem. Perhaps we never will be able to answer it. And what is this problem? How does the mush inside our skulls, right, or all of these neurons firing in this complicated way, and the, how many we have, what is it, 100 trillion
100 billion
neurons,
neurons, 100 trillion synapses,
synapses,
connections?
yes. Why does it result in our feeling the world? The way philosophers characterize trying to capture this notion of consciousness, this mysterious notion of consciousness is to be conscious means that there's something that it feels like to be that thing. We're conscious. It's the surest thing that we know about ourselves is that we are conscious. Even if it just seems to us that we're conscious, that's enough. We're conscious, right? That's really what Descartes had meant by saying, I think, therefore I am. You can't be mistaken about your own consciousness. If you're mistaken about it, you are ipso facto conscious. But why do these physical processes result in their consciousness, in there being these facts about what it's like to be this thing, that the world appears to us? It's not just the world out there, but there's the world as it is for the conscious thing, which is really, infinitely interesting. It is the difference between objectivity and subjectivity. And I agree with you that, somehow what's objectively happening results in this subjectivity, but we still can't understand why, and it is a limitation. And even mapping it out, getting the geography of consciousness still doesn't touch this particular problem. So I would just hate for the singularity of this problem, the hardness, the mystery of it, to be lost in all of the wonderful scientific things that we've since learned.
But just to be clear, and correct me if I'm wrong, the hard problem of consciousness as you've just described it does not deny that consciousness is a manifestation of the physical activity of the brain. So it doesn't mean that there's a soul, doesn't mean that there's a ghost, doesn't mean that there's life after death. It's completely compatible with the scientific understanding that consciousness consists entirely of brain activity.
Exactly.
So that's not what makes the hard problem hard.
That's not what makes the hard problem.
So it's important to clarify that.
The hard problem is compatible with materialism, that is, that consciousness is nothing but brain processes. We just don't understand exactly how. But it's also compatible with dualism, because, when you said that we know exactly what's going on in the brain and you use it, that corresponds with consciousness, a one-to-one correspondence between brain processes and mental states is compatible with dualism. But the more we learn about the brain, the less probable but still possible dualism is. But one of the interesting things is, if you keep the hard problem in mind, is to realize that matter is still somewhat mysterious to us. To me, matter is more mysterious than the mind, because matter gives rise to the mind. And it's hard to wrap your head around this, how this happens. And so it's, it has implications, even if you are a materialist. I call it materialism without physicalism, where physical means, actually making the reduction of the mental states to the physical state, seeing that they're nothing but this, in the way that we've made successful reductions in science before, that we have many of them. Heat is nothing but molecular motion. Lightning is nothing but, Heat is nothing but molecular motion. Lightning is nothing but electrical discharge. We have a lot of these nothing buts. Yeah. We don't have that yet with consciousness.
Yes, just to make clear what the so-called hard problem of consciousness is, the term is a bit of a joke. It was introduced by a philosopher named David Chalmers, hard problem, easy problem. And the reason it's a joke is that the easy problem is not easy. It's the entire science of consciousness. But the reason that he distinguished the scientific problem from consciousness from other questions that you can ask about consciousness is that some of them just seem very, very, very puzzling, very hard to wrap your mind around. For example, one that has occurred to many, many people: how do I know that the red that you see is the same as the red that I see? Now, of course, we both look at a red object and I say red and you say red, but maybe inside your head, you're actually experiencing it as what I would call green, but you've learned to connect the green experience with the word red, and so I can't tell from the outside that your inner experience is different, but maybe it is. It's very hard. You can think about that a lot without making any progress on it.
We have a better example of that in our relationship, which is Steve does not like chocolate, right? Which is, I know that he can't possibly taste chocolate the way that I taste chocolate, because how could one not like that taste, right? This is inconceivable. So
that could be another example. Or another one that also discussed a lot by philosophers is the so-called problem of the zombie. Now, the zombie problem is not like the zombies in science fiction movies that kind of walk around with a glassy stare and slow and clumsy movements. The crucial thing about a zombie is that a zombie is exactly like a human being, but doesn't have anything, any subjective conscious experience. They're like robots that are indistinguishable from you and me. In fact, as far as you know, I might be a zombie in this definition of zombie. So the philosophical analysis, or the philosophical question, again, the hard problem of consciousness is, could there be zombies? Is that a coherent concept? And if so, what is the extra ingredient that makes me not a zombie? Because actually, I don't know. You may all be zombies for all I know, according to this meaning of the word zombie. That's why it's called hard. It's hard because you keep thinking, you keep thinking, you keep thinking, and it just seems eternally puzzling.
Yeah. So, what we would want for a real reduction is, in some future date, the neuroscientist is looking at the brain, puts your brain into the brain scan, into the fMRI, and is watching what's going on and saying, by golly, this man tastes chocolate the way I taste licorice, right? Be able to actually deduce the what is it like to be-ness of Steven Pinker from looking at his brain. And that's what we would want to solve the hard problem. Anyway, you can one of the things that's very hard for people often to understand, even scientifically sophisticated people, is what is it that philosophers do? What's left for philosophers to do? And I think and I hope you agree with me here, because otherwise our marriage is on the rocks, that you can see in terms of this kind of discussion, philosophers first proposed questions, and it was Descartes, René Descartes, the great 17th century rationalist philosopher, who really first proposed what we used to call the mind-body problem until David Chalmers rechristened it, the hard problem of consciousness. And, he proposed this problem, and philosophers afterwards sort of laid out the possibilities. Descartes was a dualist. He believed that the mind and the body were two separate things, laying out the metaphysical possibility that the mind could survive, the personal identity could survive the death of the body. Leibniz took a different approach to it. He was an idealist. Then Hobbes was a materialist. Thinking is nothing but matter in motion. But the question was proposed by a philosopher. The possible answers, compatible with everything that we then knew, were laid out by philosophers. Scientists did get to work, finally, quite recently, on what could be empirically determined surrounding this question. And then it's the role of philosophers to chime in and say, yes, I've studied everything that you've accomplished here, and it's fantastic, and what an addition to our knowledge, but you still haven't answered the question that we first proposed. And I think, when you look at our discussions of consciousness, it's recapitulating the whole history of philosophy and science. Perhaps that's very grandiose. I wouldn't say that. Mostly we just talk about what to have for dinner, but sometimes on a good night, we're recapitulating this history.
To go on to the second topic?
Okay, now that we've exhausted consciousness. So we want to leave plenty of time for questions, of course. So another, do you want to introduce this problem?
Sure.
Yes.
Another topic that has been long discussed in philosophy and more recently by science is the question of what makes us moral, or what makes us engaged in moral reasoning, moral emotions, moral deliberation. And there is a growing part of psychology that is concerned with at least the moral sense, conscience, moral argument, moral condemnation, moral emotions. Some of it seeks to explain why we have moral feelings in terms of the problem of cooperation. How do people work together to achieve something that benefits them both, or benefits them all? And a leading idea from evolutionary biology is that there can be an evolutionary advantage, a Darwinian advantage, to having certain moral emotions if it allows people to do good deeds for each other over the long term without either one being exploited. So if you fall down and I help you get up, and then later I have to run out and I need someone to take care of the kids, and you babysit for my kids for a while, we both end up better off than if each one ignored the other. But what allows that to happen? What allows a species to exchange favors without one exploiting the other? Say, I will accept a favor from you when I fall and you help me up, but then when you need a favor, I say, well, it's your problem, it's not my problem. I got my benefit, and to hell with you. One of the reasons that doesn't happen, that cooperation can evolve in the human species, and we're very unusual animals in the degree to which we cooperate. No other species cooperates, at least not with non-relatives, the way that humans do. And one answer is we evolved with certain emotions like gratitude. If you do a favor for me, that triggers an emotion in my brain that makes me want to return the favor. Or guilt. If you have done me a favor and I have not returned it, or if I have harmed you, then I feel bad about it, and I'm motivated to make amends, to help you in the future. Or anger. If I have done you a favor and then when I need a favor you don't reciprocate, I'm angry because you're so ungrateful, and I might try to punish you or shame you or avoid you. Well, with that moral sense that if you take a favor from someone else, you ought to pay it back, and that you're a bad person if you don't, we can see biologically why that would evolve, and that explains perhaps some of our moral emotions, like gratitude, like guilt, like anger, like sympathy. Psychologists have also noted that not all of our moral sense actually comes from doing good or avoiding harm, and that we can be just as morally engaged with kinds of behavior that don't harm anyone, like homosexuality. I know that just, I think it was 2 months ago, where India decriminalized homosexuality. That's a reminder that for thousands of years in many cultures, people thought that two people having sex together in private, harming no one, giving pleasure to each other, that there was still something wrong with it. Or consensual incest. If a brother and a sister decided to make love and each knew what they were doing, let's say they were using contraception, so there was no risk of a deformed child. Let's say they were perfectly happy with it, so neither would feel guilty. Is it wrong? Well, psychological experiments have shown that people think it's wrong even if they can't explain what's wrong, and even if they agree that no one is hurt, only people are helped. We still have that intuition. So it raises the question of once we understand human moral psychology, that's just an introduction, a couple of examples. Is that all there is to morality? Or is morality just a product of our brains, in the same way that color vision is a product of our brains? Could there be moral illusions in the same way that there are perceptual illusions? Any of you who've taken a psychology course or have looked at some of the demonstrations that go around the internet, where you might see two lines, one looks longer than the other, but because of the context, they're actually the same line. Or if there are very yellow street lights in a parking lot, you can't find your car because the color looks different, so that's a color illusion. Could there, in the same way that there are length illusions and color illusions, could there be moral illusions, where there's a discrepancy between what we feel is moral and what really is moral? Homosexuality may be an example where more and more societies are saying, even if some people declare that it's immoral, they're wrong. It's not immoral. And psychologists who study the moral sense look at moral illusions. I'll give you just one more before turning it over to Rebecca to raise the question of whether that makes what could make it a moral illusion. So if I were to ask, who is the most moral person you can think of? Most people would probably say Mother Teresa. But if you think about whether Mother Teresa actually did, well, she looks very moral. She wore a white sari. Many photographs show her washing the feet of the poor. She was obviously decided to live a life of poverty. But how many people did she help? Did she actually cure the diseases of the people that she treated? Did she actually reduce the poverty of the people she dealt with? Should we perhaps think that a man like Norman Borlaug is actually much more moral than Mother Teresa? And if you're thinking to yourself, who's Norman Borlaug? Well, that would be my point. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for thinking up the Green Revolution, the revolution in agriculture that multiplied the amount of food that could be produced on a piece of land because he developed new varieties of crops. He is credited with the fact that India, which used to be known, especially in the West, as the land of famine, now grows enough food to prevent famines. India, of course, exports food. thanks to Norman Borlaug. So by saving, he's been credited with saving 1 billion lives. Should we consider him to be the most moral person that ever lived? Well, intuitively, emotionally, we don't think that way. Could that be another moral illusion? However, in the case of a perceptual illusion, we call it an illusion because the human brain says that line is longer than that line, but then we pull out a ruler and we say objectively they are the same. There is a reality to length, even if our brain fools us. Now the question is, if I'm talking about a moral illusion, that presupposes that there is a moral reality against which we can compare the human moral sense, that there can be a moral yardstick in the same way there's a physical yardstick. And then that too is, I think we would agree, more a question of philosophy. That's where science not only cannot answer that question, but for science even to talk about a moral illusion, it presupposes a certain philosophical position.
Exactly, yes. So, yeah, you set it up so beautifully by making the distinction.
Closer to your mouth.
Closer,
Yeah.
yes. Sorry. You set it up so beautifully by making the distinction between the moral, the very concept of a moral illusion presupposes moral truth, right? There can't be illusions unless there's truth. And of course, the philosophical question is what grounds this moral truth? How in fact do we determine it? And there is, of course, the religious answers that were proposed, and different religions have different answers to this question. And many people believe that without religion, there could be no grounding of morality. We have such very different views about what is moral. Steve's example of homosexuality, for example, which is condemned at least by all of the Abrahamic religions, is a very good example of something that's laid down in holy books and that many people certainly accept, and that corresponds with many people's intuitions in any case, independently. So the question, of course, in philosophy is, which tries to approach these questions of the grounding of morality. What is it that makes certain things truly moral? Is it the greatest good for the greatest number? This is the notion of utilitarianism. Or is it, which itself presupposes the importance of everybody, that everybody's good has to be taken into account in determining what is the best? You were using a kind of utilitarian measuring stick or paradigm when you proposed that Mother Teresa is not such a moral person compared to what's his name?
Norman Borlaug.
Norman Morlock, yes, because he bettered more lives, so that human flourishing, the greatest good of the greatest number, is what really adds up to morality. And there are other views that there are simply certain acts, even if they would lead to the greatest good, and this is a view that is most associated with the Western philosopher Immanuel Kant. They are intrinsically wrong. So an example that is often used is supposed a terrorist has hidden a bomb somewhere. We know it's a children's playground, or let's make it really horrific. And philosophers love to think up these sort of thought experiments. And the only way to get it out of him is to torture him. Now, the utilitarian standard would say, yes, of course, it's justified. You can torture him. It will save many lives. It will put one person in extreme pain, but it will save many lives and children's lives. What could be clearer? there are other people who think no, that there is something intrinsically wrong with torture, and so it can never be justified. And so these are different moral intuitions about what grounds morality, but that's the kind of question that philosophers are very interested in trying to answer. And of course, your own work, which I would like to talk about, in that we've made moral progress over the centuries, over the millennia, that we have, the whole notion of moral progress presupposes, some standard by which we can judge. Certainly from a religious point of view, people could say, quite the contrary. This has been a moral regression. We found ways to justify what is sinful, what God has commanded us not to do. So your thesis that of moral progress presupposes, answers to this great philosophical question, with which we have made progress, in fact, that I would argue that approaching these questions through pure reason rather than authority, faith, those sorts of mechanisms have given us the kind of progress that you have documented.
Right. Although it wouldn't be exactly accurate to say that philosophy, as an entire field or an entire enterprise, gives an answer to that question, because the philosophers disagree with each other. So it'd be, so for example, the notion of progress that I've defended as a real fact of history, namely people live longer, they are less poor, they're less hungry, they're less diseased. Of course, that is a kind of utilitarian characterization of progress, namely progress would be that which consists of an increase in aggregate human well-being. But there could be philosophers say, well, who says that's progress? That's not what morality consists of, and so the fact that that has increased can't be called moral progress.
Actually, I think that there's more unanimity among philosophers than not on this question. So the sort of controversy that involves specific cases like torture, you play up the difference between what we call utilitarian theories and deontological theories that concentrate on specific acts. But if you actually compare all of the moral theories that have been proposed, what all of them have in common is that there's a recognition of I'm going to slip into my favorite language, of the mattering of human life, that each human life is important. And even Kant, who's not a utilitarian, who proposed a theory that's always opposed to utilitarianism, contrasted with it, said that one of the ways in which he characterized his categorical imperative, which was that each person has to be looked at as never a means to an end, but a kingdom of ends in herself. He, of course, said himself, but I'm going to say herself. And indeed, that is what a good deal of the progress that we've made in recognizing that, morally speaking, gender doesn't make any difference, race doesn't make any difference, nationality, ethnicity doesn't make any difference. I don't think you could find a philosopher, no matter their moral theory, that would argue with that.
If it characterized that abstractly, yeah.
If you characterize it on that level of abstraction, yes.
Although I think philosophers who are in a religious way of thinking very well could. I mean, as you mentioned, there are philosophers, say, in a Catholic tradition who would say it's all been downhill since the 18th century, when people started to lose their faith in rock-solid moral precepts and started to what you and I would call utilitarianism or consequentialism they would call selfishness, that all you care about is a shallow conception of your own well-being as opposed to obeying commandments that are bigger than any human, that are come from outside, that therefore are much more eternal, much more profound than mere happiness. So I think certainly the non-religious, the religious philosophers might even disagree even with that. I would.
True. If one defines philosophy to be what can we establish using reason alone, which is my definition of philosophy, I guess I'm by definition excluding philosophers who, unless they could justify by resorting to reason alone why morality has to be based on the Word of God, even though different religions disagree on what the Word of God is, and causing great divisiveness among us. Of course, they would say that makes no difference because human flourishing is not the thing to mention. I think somehow we've left out any mention of Jonathan Haidt in this connection, and I think he ought to be mentioned here.
Well, I alluded to his work and you're right that I should have mentioned him in talking about the way in which our moral sense, our meaning human beings in general, does not just consist of fairness or good treatment to other people, but can also include intuitions of purity and disgust. That's probably what drives people's condemnation of homosexuality. It can also include obedience to authority, and so people tend to morally condemn insubordination, disobedience, disrespect to a legitimate authority. It can include conformity to community norms, so people will often condemn and punish people who are just nonconformists, including, say, transgender individuals or cross-dressers or just people who behave differently. And that one could even perhaps say that of those different spheres, those different activities that we tend to moralize, a philosopher could argue, well, some of them actually deserve to be called moral and others are just quirks of our brain, just legacies, baggage that was handed down to us by evolution that are bugs in the way our brains function, but that can't be justified as really moral by the lights of
Exactly, yeah. So Haidt had, I think, identified 5 sources of these strong intuitions, moral intuitions that we have. Fairness, harm to others, loyalty to the group, authority, and purity. So many of the laws have to do with this purity. And so these are very strong intuitions that people have, and that can be explained by evolutionary psychology, why they might have evolved. But we want to distinguish between them. Some of them we can actually come up with justifications for fairness, for why fairness is a moral principle, for why harming others, not harming others, is a moral principle. It's much harder. We can come up with evolutionary explanations for group loyalty, for purity, certainly for purity. That's very, very clear. Perhaps you ought to state that since you're the evolutionary psychologist.
Yes, what disgusts us we often think of as immoral. Homosexuality might be an example, but also for people if you ask people, well, let me think of an example that's fit for polite company. Well, incest would be another one. Brother-sister incest, if it's completely consensual, if no one is harmed, we have an inborn revulsion to incest for an intelligible evolutionary reason, namely that when a brother and a sister or other close relatives have sex, there's a much greater chance that they'll give birth to a deformed child because harmful recessive genes can find each other. They're much more likely to find each other if the two parents are biologically related in the first place and share so many genes. But the transition from just finding it undesirable, disgusting, repulsive, something you don't want to do, to something that you would condemn other people for doing is an extra leap and an additional twist in moral psychology that was thought up by a former student of mine, Peter DeScioli, and his graduate advisor, Robert Kurzban, is that a lot of our moral emotions really consist in condemnation. If you actually think of how often do we think about right or wrong, sometimes it's what should I do? What's the right thing to do? I'm agonized. Should I do this? Should I do that? This one is tempting, but it's wrong. This one is right, but it might hurt me. But a lot of when we think of in moral terms, what we think of is that jerk, that evil person, that asshole. We use our moral psychology a lot to figure out reasons to condemn other people and to all form a coalition where we all agree that someone is the wrongdoer, someone is the demon, and we gang up on that person. We form a shaming mob. And according to this theory, one of the reasons that our moral sense evolved is to allow groups of people to form a majority coalition where they can all pick on some victim and all agree on what that victim did wrong. And if it's homosexuality, if it's worshiping the wrong God, if it's supporting the wrong team, if it's doing something that's disgusting, well, at least we all agree that that's a wrong thing because it all seems bad to us. And so the coalitional psychology feeds our moral psychology.
Yeah, and of course it's very, given everything that you've said, it's possible to state that this kind of behavior that you've just explained, why it evolved and what good it did to the tribe, leads to immoral behavior. And that's not a contradiction in terms, showing that we mean something quite different by morality. Oh, I probably said the most important thing and I didn't say it into the microphone. The most important thing that I've said, right? Not that you said. But that there's no contradiction in terms of saying that this kind of explanation that gives rise to these very strong moral attitudes that determine behavior is very often immoral behavior. And the fact that that's not a contradiction in terms means that we're appealing to some different notion of morality that philosophers over the millennia, I mean, starting with the ancient Greeks, have been trying to refine and have made, I think, a great deal of progress to the betterment of our world. So I think certainly time for questions.
Open up for questions, yes. And is there a microphone that's going to find the questioner? There's someone running around with a microphone? Yes, very good.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, question for Rebecca. What does materialism have over and above a physicalist reductionism and yet is not dualistic? A question for Pinker. So I understand that it may be untenable to accept the dualism, yet we have to give Descartes his due because the way he isolated thought is, it expands our thinking. So a lot of work in linguistics combined with work in evolutionary biology, anthropology has somewhere got us closer to addressing the dualism by locating recursion as a unique aspect of the human species. Do you think recursion adequately addresses the dualism? And where should we go from recursion to addressing the left out parts?
Well, I think the concept of recursion is refers to a computational procedure that can invoke an instance of itself. So for example, in math class, if you're asked what is how do you compute a factorial, and they will say, well, 6 factorial is just 6 times 5 factorial. That's a recursive definition. It sounds circular, and you break the circle by saying that 1 factorial equals 1. So that's just a definition of what recursion is. And I think you're alluding to a suggestion that the linguist Noam Chomsky made about 10 years ago, that what makes language, human language, unique and special and different from animal communication systems is that it has recursion. We can have, when we speak, a sentence that contains a sentence, such as, I think that his theory is false. Well, his theory is false is a sentence. I think that sentence is a sentence, so we've got a sentence inside a sentence. That's recursion. Or even if I say, the man's hat is nice. Hat is a noun phrase. The man's hat is a noun phrase. We have a noun phrase inside a noun phrase. More generally, recursion is combining phrases according to rules without any limit. I think that is something that is characteristic of human language. It's not found in other animal communication systems. I don't think it's the only thing that's unique to language, but I don't think it has anything to do with dualism, because it is characterizing human language computationally in terms of information processing, in terms of the mental algorithms that the brain implements. But we know from the fact that computers can implement algorithms without any dualism, no soul, no spirit, no ghost. If the computer can do it, then the fact that humans can execute algorithms does not call for dualism. We have to forgive us. We have some 2 fans behind us with very loud ventilation noise, and then the amplified voice also echoes and reverberates, so it's a little difficult for us to pick out the exact words of some of the questions.
Yes. So I know that you asked me a question, but I didn't catch it at all.
I asked about materialism. What does it have over and above a physicalist reductionism?
Oh, yes. So my notion of materialism without physicalism, what it has is that we don't have a physicalist reduction yet. The proof of that is the hard problem of consciousness remains. It's not solved. None of the easy answers have solved it. I can't look at Steve's brain in action while he's eating chocolate and know, aha, it's black licorice for him, right? No wonder he doesn't like it. So that would be what physical reduction, that's what we hope for, physical reductionism. We don't have it yet. But what I was saying is that the fact that we don't have it yet doesn't entail immaterialism, that the mind is something other than the material brain. It simply it's still compatible with its being the material brain. We just haven't made the physical reduction yet, and maybe we won't. Maybe we never will. Maybe there's something singular about this problem so that we will never be able to solve it. It's hard to imagine, given the sort of science that we have now, which is basically a science describing matter in motion. At its most fundamental level, that's what physics is really describing, matter in motion, how that description would entail the subjective description. We just can't imagine it yet. But that does not itself entail dualism or immaterialism. So that's what I was trying to get across there.
Yeah.
Hello. By now we have established that it's different moral sets or standards of each communities, and that's why we don't have an agreement on what the moral standard for the entire world should be. So, and given that you said that philosophers like thought experiments and extreme thought experiments at that, so let's say there was the God or some source that came, that just like took over the world and said that this is the moral standard that I want all of you to follow, otherwise you're going to hell. Now, I'm not saying which God, so don't take offense. It's just a God or the God. So in that case, do you think that humans will stick to that moral code of conduct, or given their rebellious act that is ingrained in their consciousness, do you think they will still like to rebel and see what happens?
Yeah, I think that we do like to act in our own self-interest, and so if a voice would come down from the heavens and say, I am the Lord your God, thou shalt have no other gods before me, and you better do this, I think we would. Yes, I think that would convince. Would that convince me, or would I think that I was hallucinating? I probably would think I was hallucinating. I'd probably ask you to commit me. And if you told me, no, you heard it too, I would think I was hallucinating that as well. But I think if it was really persuasive, it was cogent, I think most of us, yes, would follow that. It's just that we... the philosopher Bertrand Russell, who was also a very wonderful mathematical logician, had been asked a question similar and said, what if you, after you die, and he was a declared atheist, he was very forthright about his atheism, and showing that you could establish morality on non-theistic grounds. But he was asked, Lord Russell, what happens if after you die, and you get to the gates of heaven, and, there is St. Peter, or Gabriel, I don't remember who's supposed to meet you at the gates of heaven, what will you say to him? And he will say, why didn't you provide more evidence? If you wanted me to believe, why didn't you provide more evidence for us? But if we did, I think we would all follow it.
So in your talk, you mentioned about the majority and how we think as a majority. So as a species, are we prone to majoritarianism? Because of the way we're going with the Brexit and, so are we prone to the tyranny of the majority?
I don't think so. No, in fact, if anything, I think we're prone to authoritarianism, where it's the charismatic leader, the chief, who gets to decide. And democracy is until recently, has not been the majority form of government. It's really, democracy's only taken off in the second half of the 20th century. So I don't think it's majority rule I think there's conformity. If you have a general sense that something is the norm, this is what you do, this is what you don't do, that tends to be moralized. But actually counting and saying greater than 51%, that's how we should decide, I don't think it's particularly intuitive. Let's see. Back there?
Hello, sir. And speaking about the morality, the thing you said, isn't there, if I say I am against incest, so even my morality is biased, because if I see incest in Game of Thrones, I don't have an issue. But if I say my friend is doing it, I have a problem. So even our own morality has double standards rather than his or mine. And the second thing is, isn't the second problem also, can it also be solved if we get the solution to the first big problem? Because the second problem is arising because I feel something wrong, because when I see something or when I hear about incest or homosexuality, I feel something. So if I could know or if I could be in the shoes of another person and understand how he feels about it, I think that problem is also solved. So doesn't it mean that it is just one big problem rather than two different problems?
So that if we solve the problem of consciousness, that we would be able to solve the problems of morality as well? Was that your thesis? Yeah, I think there is some truth to that. I think this hard problem of consciousness, of how to get objectivity, or how to merge objectivity and subjectivity, how to get from an objective description how these various subjectivities arise. I think this runs through many philosophical problems. I'm not sure it would. I'd have to think it through, what you're saying. I think it's an interesting proposition. I think I know a lot about how other people feel about morality. Their words express it. Their actions express it. I don't need to get into their brains to know. It seems to me I don't need to solve the hard problem of consciousness to know really how others think. I know myself, I've changed my moral views. I was brought up very religiously, and I've changed my moral views. So I know what it's like to hold within myself two very different moral positions about things like homosexuality. So I'm not sure, but I think this is an interesting connection you're making here.
We have time for just one more question, sir.
Thank you, sir. My question is with regards to the findings, whether there is something like a right brain and a left brain, and what is the kind of consciousness and how would it be affected? I recently read that this theory of right brain, left brain is also being negated. How far is it true, and to what extent would consciousness be affected, sir?
Yes. So the expression left brain person, right brain person, or reasoning from the left side of your brain, the right side of your brain, is based on some real cognitive neuroscience. The left and right hemispheres are not interchangeable. The left hemisphere is far more specialized for language and for logical step-by-step reasoning. The right hemisphere is a bit more specialized toward recognizing facial expressions, recognizing tone of voice. But still, they overlap. They talk to each other a lot across that cable called the corpus callosum. And no normal person is completely dominated by their left brain or their right brain. And the two hemispheres, they do overlap in their function a lot. Both of them subserve consciousness, and one of the reasons we know that is from the split brain surgery done to treat epilepsy, in which the two hemispheres no longer talk to each other, but it seems as if each one of them has its own consciousness, that it shows the signs of consciousness in being able to react intelligently to momentary demands, to registering pain and pleasure, and so on. So there is something that we don't really understand of how you could have one consciousness, then take a knife, and then you have two consciousnesses.
Well, that ends our session for this evening. A round of applause for both our speakers, please.